Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to create a AWS Step Function and then integrate it with a couple different Lambda functions as well. I'm also going to show you how to use the Step Function choice state so that you can control the flow of your Step Function based on the input arguments that are passed into it. I'll also show you how to access the output of your Lambda function from within the Step Function if you need to do that as well. So just to show you what we're going to do before we get into creating the step function. So this is what we're going to be creating in this video. So we're going to have a choice state right at the beginning. We're going to be passing in a JSON object that has a type field, and the type is either going to be of type purchase or of type refund. Now, depending on the type that is passed in, we're going to take one of two different directions. If it's purchase, we're going to go in this direction. And if it's refund, we're going to go in this direction. And then in the result handler, we're just going to pull out the returns from each of these Lambda functions. So the objects that it returns, and then just print it out here so that you can see what it looks like if you want to access the information as it flows from Lambda to Lambda within your step function. So that's what we're going to do in this video. So let's get started. All right, so let's get started by heading over to the step function section of the AWS console. I'm just going to type in step functions here. And I'm going to be doing this all through the console, which is, I recommend to do it this way, at least when you're starting out. We're going to be using the studio style editor like I showed you in the intro. It's very intuitive, and you get to create a ASL or Amazon States Language JSON object that you can integrate into like Terraform or CDK or CloudFormation or whatever you're using. But to get started, it's very handy to do this directly in the console. So if it's your first time here, you're going to see a screen like this one. You can click on Get Started, and this will walk you through the kind of wizard here. Or you can go to the left-hand side here and click on State Machines. And then let's do it this way, actually. So we click on State Machines, then we're going to create a state machine. Now, just one thing about the terminology, the state machine is kind of like your workflow template. So we're going to be creating the state machine in this next step here, and that's going to have like the different Lambda functions that we're going to be integrating with. And then there's a concept called a execution, and an execution is just a run of your state machine. So in our example, like we're kind of working with placing orders. So we're going to be creating a order state machine, and every time someone places an order, that would be an execution of a state machine. I just wanted to clarify that in case you're confused by the terminology here. All right, so let's go ahead and click on Create State Machine here. And one of the first things you need to decide in the Studio Editor here is how you want to create your state machine. So you can choose to design your workflow visually, which is going to be the method that we use here using the Workflow Studio, which is, I have to say, an excellent feature from AWS. Makes it very, very easy to define your step function. And there's just a lot of tools at your disposal directly in the Studio Editor. You can also do it through code if you want, using that Amazon States Language or ASL. Typically, like I mentioned, the flow is to create it visually in your console here, and then you can export it to code, and then you can incorporate your code into your infrastructure as code or your source control if you're like using Git or anything like that. You can also run a sample project if you want to see something that's already pre-built, but that's a different question here. Then you also need to decide on the type. Now, do you want to use standard or express? Standard are the classic type that's been around since the beginning of step functions. Express are relatively new. Now, if you click on the Help Me Decide button here, you can start to see some of the differences between these two. So for standard, they can run for up to 1 year, whereas express are 5 minutes or so. And the execution start rate, it's basically the difference in the scale that these two types can support. Pricing is a little bit different as well. So it's $25 per million state transitions, and you're charged using kind of a different mechanism here. So you're charged $1 per million executions and a duration price. And then another important detail here that may help you decide is the execution semantics. So exactly once workflow execution for standard versus at least once execution. So standard are much more kind of reliable and consistent in terms of their state, but the penalty is that they're more expensive and they support like kind of lower throughput compared to express. Now, if you're working with something that has like very short durations and you can tolerate at least once workflow execution, you should go with express. But if you're looking for something that, you know, maybe like a banking application or like in our case, an order placement application where, you know, if one of the tasks executes twice, that could mean that your order is placed twice. That's not really tolerable in this type of application. So in that case, I would choose something like standard. So that's what we're going to do in this tutorial. So we're going to minimize that. We're going to pick on standard, and we're going to go ahead and click on next in the bottom right here. All right, so this is the workflow studio of the step functions, and this is where we're going to create our state machine. So just to lay out kind of what we're seeing here. So on the left-hand side are kind of the control panel in terms of the different widgets or the different integrations that we can pull in. And you can see we're currently under the actions section, and the actions are basically the services that you can integrate with. So we're going to be using Lambda in our case, but here are some other popular ones like Amazon SNS, ECS, step functions if you want to start another step function from within this step function. And then you can like scroll through here and see there's a ton. So like the most common services. So here's the one for S3. And you can scroll through here and see what's available. But there are quite a few different services that are directly supported using step functions here. All right, so let's just reset that. Okay, so obviously we're going to be using Lambda Invoke. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but let me just kind of give you the tour of the studio here. There's also the flow controls, and flow controls, like they kind of imply, help you kind of embed your business logic into your step function. So the choice one is very important because it lets you add if then else logic. You can add separate branches through the parallel choice or the parallel flow. Then there's map, if it's kind of like a for loop. A pass is just an indicator really that helps you just show where you are in the step function. There's a wait if you want to create a delay, and then if you want to mark something as a success at an intermediary point, or likewise a failure like in this case here. All right, so that's what's going on the left-hand side here. There's also patterns, which are some preformed kind of setups that Step Functions creates for you and makes available if you want to do things like process buckets in S3, and they're adding to this all the time. So it's important to like kind of keep up to date with what's going on here. All right, so let's put it back on actions. Now the center here is where we're going to be creating or defining the workflow of our step function. And we're going to be dragging and dropping things in here in a moment. And you're going to see us kind of like build the topology of our state machine graph directly here in the center here. And on the right side is where we define the parameters or the configuration options of our states. So you'll see when we select one of the states here. So for example, if I click on, well, you can't click anything here actually because there's nothing there. But it's going to give options here that you can select. So for Lambda, you're going to be able to access things like, what's the function ARN that you want to execute? Do you want a retry policy, a timeout, all that kind of stuff. And let me just pull that over so we can make more real estate here. All right, and then when you're done, you just go to next, but let me walk you through the steps here. All right, so what is the first thing that we want to do? So we're going to be passing in a JSON object that has one field, and the field is going to be type, and the value is either going to be purchase or refund. And depending on that value, we're going to take one of two directions. So let's set up that choice flow first, or that choice state. So we're going to simply go to the flows option here. We're going to go to choice, drag that in here, and there you go. As you can see right off the bat, on the right, it's asking us for some options. All right, so when you select this, you can see like when we have rule number 1, we're going to go in this direction. When we have a default rule, we're going to go in this direction. So let's modify rule number 1 by clicking on this little option here. And we're going to simply go to, click on that, and it's going to scroll down into here. And we're going to say rule number 1, and we're going to say add a new condition. And the condition is where we're going to say basically like, is the type purchase or not? So we're going to click on that, add condition. And then we're going to use a simple evaluation logic here. You can also do ands or ors if you want to make something a little bit more sophisticated. And this uses JSON path notation. So for our case, it's just going to be $.type. And $.dot is just a placeholder here. That's not actually what my object is going to look like, but type is the key. So that's an important detail here. And then in terms of the operator, we're going to pick, you can see there's many. So like is present, is of type, is equal to, less than, greater than, all that kind of stuff. Is equal to is what we want. And then the value is going to be a string constant, and it's going to be purchase. All right, so save conditions. And then you can see here immediately it updated. And so that's great. So let's do the same thing for refund. So let's close out the purchase one now. And let's see if we can delete the default. Can we delete that? Maybe not. So we may have to deal with that. Maybe not. Okay, let's click on add new choice for the second one. And so we want rule number 2 now, and we're going to add a condition, and we're going to do pretty much the exact same thing. So $.type, and we're going to say refund, or sorry, is equal to here, and string constant and refund. All right, so go to save conditions. All right, now you can see we have two different ones here, purchase and refund, and there should be a way to get rid of the default now since we have two options, yeah? So that clear button is what did it for us. All right, perfect. You can kind of fiddle with some of the different settings here as well, like input, and if you want to do different filters based on the input and like pass specific outputs based on what was passed in, you can play with the choice state as well. All right, so now we have pretty much what we need to integrate with our Lambda functions now. So let's do that. So we're going to go to actions. And we're going to simply go to AWS Lambda. You can also search for it here. Make sure you select the invoke method or the invoke API. So click on that, drag it in, and similarly, you can see some things change on the right. But let me just drag in both the purchase and the refund, and then we'll fill them in one by one. All right, so I'm going to click on the one over here on the left-hand side. The first thing I like to do is give this a nice name because if you have really big step functions or state machines, this can get really out of control if you're not naming things well. So this is the purchase handler. And let me just name both while I'm here. So purchase handler and refund handler. Oops, refund handler. Okay, so this is complaining because we haven't given it a ARN for our purchase and refund step function. So let's kind of fill out all the details here. All right, so specify function name. That's why it's complaining. That's fine. So let's do that. Some options that you should be aware of. There's the integration type here, which is the default. I would suggest leaving it as default unless you have a reason to use the AWS SDK version. By using the optimize, it does some like quality of life improvements like unescaping JSON when it passes it into your Lambda function and stuff. You can click on info if you want to learn more. And then for function name, you're going to want to click on that. And mine was called the purchase handler. I'm going to show you the code for this in a second. It's very, very simple, but just keep that in mind. And then it's asking you for payload. So we're going to use the state input, which means that like the type is going to pass in the start. It's going to go to choice. If it's purchase, it's going to flow through here. So inside here in the input arguments of our Lambda function, we're going to have access to the type field in our JSON object, and we can read off that if we want to do something interesting. You can optionally change this if you want to have like a custom payload or no payload, but we want to pass the information through. So we're going to leave this as default. Now, an additional thing, now this is a pretty cool feature. So wait for callback. This allows you to pause your step function at this point once it enters this state. And if you read this, so pause the execution at this state until the execution receives a callback from send task success or send task failure APIs with the task token. So what you can do with this is imagine you have a flow where like before you place the order or you place the purchase order, you want someone like a human to validate, like take a look at the order. So you want to pause your step function right here. So if you do this, if you wait for callback at this point, it kind of gives you a little preview here, but let's just close that. It's going to generate a token that's going to get passed into your Lambda, and then you can save that token, and then that token can be used to call back into your Lambda function to resume it at a later point in time. It's very useful for kind of workflows where you need a pause or you need some kind of other action to take place that you're waiting on that's typically done by a human. So that's kind of how that works. All right, so that's it for configuration. Now there's some other things like input. Again, if you want to filter by input path or output. Now there is one other option that I did want to talk about, which is error handling. This is what makes step functions really, really powerful, especially when you integrate them with AWS Lambda. So what you can do is, if you choose, you can retry when certain errors take place in your Lambda function. So say like maybe you're calling a DynamoDB table in this Lambda function, or you're calling a dependency and it fails the first time. In the default case, like your Lambda function will basically, or your step function will basically get paused when this error is out. But you can add retries here that will retry when specific errors occur. So if you click on this, it's going to ask you like, what is the error name that you want to create it on? Is this on any type of error? So all, if you want to add a heartbeat, or if there's a timeout that you want to, like a Lambda timeout, there's a bunch of different errors here that you can take a look at. You can also add your own errors that like you throw, and then step function can recognize here. So custom errors is supported as well. Let me remove this or else it's gonna blow up. Actually, this is like the interval to retry. So do you want to wait 1 second? How many attempts you want to do? What's the back off rate? That kind of stuff you can customize as well. So I'm just going to remove this so it doesn't make things more complicated. And then there's also catching errors. This is also extremely, extremely powerful. So what you can do is like if you try to maybe call a dependency in this Lambda function to validate the person's, I don't know, payment details or something, and the payment details are invalid. So you want to kind of change the direction of your step function. Maybe you want to go like in a certain direction here to email the customer to say, you know, your details are invalid, something like that. You can create a catch statement that will detect a certain error type and then make a different control flow. So also very, very useful. And if you click on this, kind of similar story, you can decide which error you want to pick and what the state you want to go to next after the error occurs. So very, very helpful. Maybe I'll show you that later on if I have some time, but not for right now. Anyways, that's all you really got to do here. You can also set some timeouts. So if you don't hear back from Lambda after a period of time, or heartbeat, not going to be using that as well. And so let's go into our refund handler and just set the function name as well. So function name was refund handler. Search for that. All right, cool. So now we have the basic setup for these two Lambda functions and the state machine. Now, before we try all this out, I want to add our third one, which is when our when either of these are done, we want to kind of group the results and maybe do some other things. So I just dragged one. Let me actually, can I delete this? I think Control Z works in this, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, it does. Awesome. All right, so you can do this multiple ways, but what I'm going to do is, if that happened too quickly, I'm going to drag here, and like you can't drag this to both here. You have to kind of do one or the other. And so I'm going to do it to the left side first, and then I'm going to make it work for the right side. So let me show you what happens here. So after purchase, now it's going to trigger this Lambda function, right? Which is state name result handler, and the function name is result handler. Okay, so that's good for the left-hand side, but not for the right. So for the right, how we make like this thing point to this instead of this thing pointing to that is you just click on it and then you go to, there should be like next state or something. Yeah, so next state, right now it's at go to end, and you can change this. So now I want this to go to the result handler, and there you go. So that's exactly how you change it. It's pretty straightforward. All right, so that is it for like actually defining our step function or state machine. Let me show you what the code looks like for each of these functions really quick. It's very, very simple. So the purchase handler, that's this one here. And so that's the purchase handler. All it does is return an object with a result type, and it's purchase process success in this case, okay? And then the refund handler, which is the right-hand side, is very similar, pretty much the same, and it is refund process success. So just refund is different. And then the result handler, note that we're returning an object with a result key in it, and it has this value, right? Result is the same for both the purchase handler, see, result, purchase, and then result refund, okay? Now in my result handler, I want to read off of whatever this is, right? So I want to know if it's a refund or a success. So to access that information, it's very simple. It's right here. So step function result, I'm storing that as a variable, and out of the event that's being passed into my Lambda function, I'm just pulling the field out. So pulling the key. So it's result, and then I'm returning an object that has the body key, and it's whatever was passed in plus the word underscore result. So what you're going to see when we run this step function is if I do purchase, it's going to go in this direction. And then when we hit this function here, it's going to be purchase process success underscore result. And then that's going to kind of be the end of our function. And the other way around, it's going to be refund process success. And then when we hit this one, the result is going to be with an underscore result. So that's what's going to happen here. So just to make it very, very clear. All right, so now we can proceed to the next step. But one thing I wanted to show, so definition. So this is the ASL, Amazon States language. And if I were doing this through code, using infrastructure as code, so either CDK, CloudFormation, Terraform, Pulumi, whatever you use, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can either like take this whole object here and just like copy it to your clipboard and literally use a string literal inside your infrastructure as code. Or you can kind of compose your step function using code in those IAC options, but there's no right way to do it depending on what you want. But this is why I like doing this in the console first, because it gives you this big blob, which is basically the definition of your step function. And if you were in the beginning of the video, I said you can use the Workflow Studio or you can write it as code. If you chose to write it as code, you'd have to literally write this massive monstrosity. So not recommended, but that's kind of what you'd have to do. All right, so let's go and test this thing out now to make sure it's all working. So we're gonna go to next, and there you go. So this would be the default editor, and this is actually how we used to do it before. We didn't have the studio editor before, so we had this ugly thing, which kind of is okay, but it's the same kind of story. It's giving you the topology of your state machine, and then here's the definition on the side here. You can change things here if you want. So if you want to make more attempts, if you like, you can do that as well, but not something I'm going to be changing for now. All right, so scroll down to the bottom. Let's go to next. Let's click on this and let's name this thing. So what is this? Like an order state machine. And the nice thing about doing this through the console as well is that when you create a new role, so an execution IAM role for this, it automatically detects what types of resources you're using in your step function definition, and it's going to attach the right permission policies for you. So since we're using Lambda in this case, it's going to create a role that has the ability to invoke a Lambda function, which is very convenient for us. If you don't do it this way, you're going to have to attach a role that has all the permissions for you. And if you edit your step function after you create it and add a new dependency, you're going to have to manually come back into the step function and add the role or add the permission to the role for whatever dependency that you need. So just something to be aware of, because that can cause a little bit of a headache. Then if we scroll down a little bit, we have logging. If you want some more verbose logging, if you want errors, let's just put all here just to see. It's going to send it to a particular log group. That's fine. If you want X-ray tracing to see more details into kind of where it's failing, if failures occur, then you can enable X-ray tracing too. And you can see here, so an execution will be created for full permissions, and then you can review it. So this should have some stuff. Yeah, so it has Lambda invoke resource policy here. And it's got some other thing. Oh, this is the state machine definition rather. This isn't the IAM policy. So this is something slightly different. Let's just minimize that. All right, so let's go to create state machine now. And this should just take a brief moment. If it takes too long, I'll fast forward it for you. All right, so it just created. So let's just close out this garbage up here. And okay, so now if we back up, if we go back to state machines, you can see now we have our state machine here. And the cool thing about this is in this state machine, they have this metadata here. So you can see the total amount that are currently running, how many succeeded, how many failed, how many timed out, yada, yada, yada. You can click on these to get access to the specific ones that maybe failures are important. Well, they should be important. So you can filter down really quickly. So very handy. So let's actually run this thing and show you how it works. So we're going to go back into the state machine now, and now we're going to click on start execution. And so this is the JSON object that we need to pass in now. You can give this a name. This is just a random UUID. You can leave it as default if you want. And let's just change this to type. So let's test the left-hand side of the function first and see what happens. So we're going to change this to purchase. And okay, so we're going to go to start execution now. So let's do that. And if we scroll down, you can see, okay, awesome. So it hit the choice state. It's currently running the Lambda function. You can see something happened here. So there was some kind of error in the purchase handler. So let's see what occurred. Purchase, invalid syntax. Okay, import JSON. What did I have wrong here? Okay, I have a U. Okay, I must have made a typo at some point here. So this just shows you what can go wrong and when errors actually occur. Let's just make sure I don't have any other errors. Okay, there's no U up there. There's no U up there. Okay, sorry guys, I messed this up, but maybe this is a good thing. It shows you what happens when this thing fails. So when it succeeds, it hits green. When it's blue, that means it's executing that current step. And when it's red, it fails. So you can see when there's errors here, you get access to all this and it kind of blows up. But you can also see the input is purchase. So that's what's being passed into my Lambda function. All right, sorry for that little mishap here. Let's try that again. We'll go to new execution. We'll do the same thing. So start execution, and this should work now. Please, I hope. Please don't embarrass me here. This will look really bad. All right, there we go. All right, so it succeeded, and you can see it went through the result handler as well. So let's take a look at what's inside here now. And so we're going to click on purchase. So you can see the input was purchase. We're under the input field here. And what's the output? Remember, the Lambda function returns like purchase, process, success or something. So let's see if it did that. There it is. It's in the result key. And then you can see details of the execution as well. So things like the duration down here, when it started in terms of a timeline. You can also click here to see the logs in the Lambda function if you'd like to as well. Or if you want to see the specific Lambda function definition, you can go there. Definition, this just kind of gives you what we created in the Workflow Studio before. And then the events, like these are kind of the internal semantics of how step functions work. For those of you that worked with SWF or simple workflow service before, you'll see this looks very familiar because I think they use that engine behind the scenes or something, but it's very similar to what simple workflow service does in terms of how having these tasks. So when the state gets entered, so when we enter this, it logs that. When it's getting ready to run or it schedules it for a run, that happens as well. So that's a separate one. When it actually starts, and then when it succeeds, and then when it is done. So it gives you the timeline of everything here. And then similarly, if we go to result handler, we can see pretty much the same thing. So the input to result handler was an object with result field. And that was the object. And if you remember, the output should be this exact same thing with an underscore. What did I say? I can't even remember. Underscore result. There you go. So that shows you what it looks like in the success case here. And if you scroll down, you can see the event history as well in terms of the entire step function. And so you can kind of look at this from a end-to-end flow. So for each task ID, and this is in ascending order here. Now the UI, like what you have here is basically my favorite part about using step functions because it makes it very, very easy to see what it's doing and debug in case something goes wrong. So one of the major positives of using step functions is the fact that you get this beautiful UI that really explains kind of the flow of your state machine. All right, so let's do this again, but we're going to do it for the refund step to show you what it looks like when it takes the other path. So go to new execution. Let's change this to refund. And then I'll do like whenever it's neither of those types to see what it does. I'm not even sure what it'll do. It'll probably just error out or something because we don't have a default rule. So I press to start and okay, now you can see it's going in this direction and there you go. So exactly the same thing. So if we click on choice, we can see this is what was passed in. We passed that directly to our Lambda function. And so the input was this, the output was result refund process success. And then in our result handler, it is appended with underscore result. So you can see all of this is working correctly. Let's try it when it's neither of those. So I'm just going to like put something in there. Maybe this will error out. Not sure what it's going to do. Yeah, so it blew up at the choice state. And that's because it's neither of the options that we kind of set out in the condition. So it doesn't know what to do. So that shows you what it can look like when it fails at the flow controls as well. So this has been an introduction to step functions and Lambda. I am making a course on step functions as we speak, so I will put that in the description when that is available if you're interested in learning more or you just like my teaching style or whatever. But if you like this video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much.